before you. One by one we will take you.
It's top five. Is this a top five? I think it's a top five.
We're doing a top five.
Only it's really a top 10 because there's two of us and we're each doing five.
Which always happens with us.
Yeah, because you do science fiction and I do horror, which does not explain my background at all. Maybe I should get something a little
Your background
creepier.
looks very non-horror. Mine looks very, pastel-y. So there we are. Well, and I'm doing pastels because it is, the 90s. We're doing 1994.
It was President Clinton's first term. I remember that. And it was when Tonya Harding gave Nancy Kerrigan's leg the whack during the Olympics, wasn't it?
It was Olympics pre-trials. She was doing it so she could go to the Olympics in her place.
That's right. That's really all I remember of 1994.
A year which I have to say from a sci-fi standpoint pretty much lives in infamy. Not the best year for the sci-fi as far as good sci-fi. I excluded anything horror really from my search and research on this year. So I'll be very curious to see what you picked for yours.
I excluded horror too. No,
was that because really. You had to or what? No.
I actually kind of did with one, but no, I did not do anything science fiction really.
So for those of you who may be joining us for the first time or watching us for the first time, we pick our top 5 of the year. That doesn't necessarily mean that we think they are the best movies in the category, but the best that fulfill the top 5 of that year. Maybe that we haven't seen them in decades either, too. So there's that adding to it. I will preface mine by saying that this was for 1994, and I didn't look at 3 or 2, but 1994. That was a year of a bunch of sequels.
Agreed. Totally agree. I have a list of them that I will do at the end. Yeah.
And do you have a list of horror sequels?
Yes.
Or just science fiction? Okay. Yeah, because I've got some science fiction sequels, so I'll mention those at the end too.
Okay.
And
absolutely.
A couple of honorable mentions. My number 5, which you know how much I love sequels anyway, or not. But my number 5 is a little film called RoboCop 3. The third one in the series, started by Paul Verhoeven and Peter Weller, and now we suddenly have Nancy Allen in it again. We don't know how. It's got a 90s cast. It's a 90s plot. But the trailer, it looked good. From what I remember from the film, it was an adequate sequel, but again, a sequel, very derivative of the first. There's one scene in it where RoboCop has the gun drawn and the bad guy's there, and the bad guy goes, "What do you want me to do?" And he goes, "Resist arrest." And I'm like, oh, yeah, great. Yeah, this is going to be one of those.
That sucks.
So that is my number 5, RoboCop 3.
Okay. My number 5 is what I was referring to earlier. Not really a horror movie, but it is definitely a dark fantasy. And it is a film called The Crow.
Ooh.
The Crow was directed by Alex Proyas. Remember him?
Uh-huh.
He did Dark City, which you've referred to
a lot.
The Crow is mostly remembered for tragedy reasons because Brandon Lee, Bruce Lee's son in it, was accidentally killed by a projectile from a blank in a gun. Yes. He died on set, and they had to kind of film around some scenes with him in them before the movie was completed. However, it is a great movie. Do you remember it?
I do.
It is so well done. Now, I will say some of the CGI looks a little dated now, but
yes,
the atmosphere, the cast, it's got Ernie Hudson is like the secondary lead in it. He plays the cop. Brandon Lee is great in it. It's just a really cool film that I highly recommend people revisit.
My number 4 is again carrying on my police routine. This is the one called Time Cop. This is how struggling I was to find good science fiction in 1994, because this movie starred Jean-Claude Van Damme, me and Mia Sara. I remember seeing it in theaters when it came out. I remember also seeing it on VHS later, too. One of the reasons I originally saw it is because it's directed by Peter Hyams, who I really like. This is the guy that did Outland. He did 2010.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, cool. Not the best, though. It's exactly what you would think of with a movie whose title was Time Cop. Basically, you have a guy with the incredibly great cop name of Max Walker. Max is a member of the Time Enforcement Commission, i.e., tech cop. He's assigned to go back in time and help stop the men that attacked his wife. So it's kind of a vengeance story gone bad. I remember it having some pretty good action, but not being the best, overall story. The brief synopsis is Max Walker, an officer of a security agency that regulates time, must fend for his life against a shady politician who's intent on changing the past to control the future. So that's a fairly generic plot that we've seen dozen times everywhere else. But that's basically what you got. So that was my number 4, Time Cop.
Killer, Mommy. Killer.
My number 4 is a little movie that's kind of a horror movie that's in an alternate reality. It's a movie called Wolf. Came out in 1994, as we said, and it is directed by someone that is not a horror movie director. It is directed by Mike Nichols.
Wow. Oh, is this the Jack Nicholson one?
It is.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's what I'm saying. It is basically like a horror movie in an alternate reality, because we're not used to seeing Mike Nichols direct a horror movie. However, I do really like this movie. Rick Baker did the special effects. He did the makeup. It stars Jack Nicholson, Michelle Pfeiffer. They're kind of coming back together after having done The Witches of Eastwick in the previous decade. It's also got the guy that drives me crazy, James Spader. He's like the villain of the story.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a take on the original Wolfman story, where it's kind of tragic, and it's, about a man that falls in love and he's a wolf. I really, really like this movie. I actually watched it and The Crow again before doing this, because I wanted to make sure about those two. It's not going to be a great horror movie for fans of horror movies today, because it's not one of those that jumps out at you. But I like the gothicness of it. I like the romance of it. And I particularly like the fact that he is a book publisher and works at a publishing company. So there's lots of publishing type humor.
My number 3 is considered a science fiction. As a matter of fact, it's based on the book that people said was the very first science fiction book ever written by a female. It's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This was written by Frank Darabont. It was produced by Francis Ford Coppola. It was directed by Kenneth Branagh, who also stars in it as Victor. It has Robert De Niro as the creature, Helena Bonham Carter as the love interest, Tom Hulce as the surrogate audience member, oh, tell me everything, Victor, sort of character. I remember seeing this and not liking it very much, because I felt it seemed really derivative. I didn't know what they were trying to tell, but I think I'm going to go back and rewatch it now, because this came out 2 years after Bram Stoker's Dracula.
They were cashing in on the success of that, for sure.
Yes, and I'm wondering if it was kind of a Coppola kind of subtextual plan. If 2 years later he was going to do, so-and-so's Invisible Man, or,
H.G. Wells. Yeah.
H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds or something, because if you look at the trailer for it, even the film stock, the cinematography, everything looks just like Bram Stoker's Dracula. It looks very similar to what Coppola did in that, the aesthetic and everything. This is much more of the story of Victor and his own personal perils and the monster sort of thing. Than
I
it
don't
is
remember
a classic.
it. I'm not even sure if I saw it.
I think might be cool to watch and see again. I want to revisit it because I remember not liking it because, again, I thought it was very derivative at the time, but that was the 90s. Now I might be able to appreciate it a little bit more for what they were trying to do aesthetically.
Well, how close it is to the novel. If you're going to put the author's name in the fucking title, it better be very close to the novel.
Which is, sort of what he did with Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very similar to the novel itself. And so it'll be interesting to see if, this one ends up in the North Pole and everything else just like the novel does.
Right.
But
right.
Anyway, that's my number 3, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the first science fiction novel ever written.
Wow.
Beat 'em or burn 'em. They go up pretty easy.
Well, my number 3 is landing square in the horror territory. We're back. No more dark fantasy or alternative realities. This one is pure Stephen King. It is, however, a television movie, and it was a miniseries in 1994 called The Stand.
What? Never heard of it.
Yeah, this one, it's not aged well. However, I still like it because it's got a pretty damn good cast. It's directed by Mick Garris. He's not one of my favorite directors, but I do appreciate him for getting this movie made because it had been in production limbo for a very long time. George Romero was attached at one time. It stars Gary Sinise, Molly Ringwald, Rob Lowe played Nick Andros. And it is basically what I've always referred to as a sequel to the Bible, where basically the world is wiped out by a plague and the survivors come together, both good and bad. The good are in the east, the bad are in the west, and there's a confrontation. And that is basically where the title comes from, The Stand. Takes place in Las Vegas. It's an epic 8-hour miniseries that came out in 1994. And if you haven't seen it, I liked the recent remake of it too. Honestly, I like pieces of both, but they're not perfect, either of them. But anyway, 1994's The Stand is my number 3.
That's a good number 3, I got to tell you. My number 2, as we're narrowing down, the tagline for it, I found out in the trailer, was "The torch of adventure is about to be passed." Star Trek Generations came out this year. For those of you who just know briefly Star Trek in general, this was the movie where Kirk came back.
But isn't it also the first Next Generation movie?
It's passing the torch to Next Generation.
Yeah.
So it is Next Generation taking over the movie franchise from the television franchise. Starred all of the cast of Next Generation, Patrick Stewart, Brett Spiner, Michael Dorn, all of them, but also starred William Shatner, who came back, and Malcolm McDowell, who came back as the villain in it. McDowell plays a scientist who was once in a place out of time called the Nexus, and the movie is his quest to get back to that, no matter what. And it results in Picard saying that he won't be able to defeat this evil villain alone. He needs somebody else. And he searches out Captain Kirk, who ironically entered the Nexus years and years and years and years ago when everyone thought he had originally died. But he didn't. He was alive in the Nexus. And he comes back just to die again, basically. It wasn't a bad crossover or changeover of the Next Generation story. It's not by far, it's not the worst of the movies that Trek has done. It's not the best. They kind of waste Malcolm McDowell, but it's a good passing of the torch, I guess, would be. And it's my number 2.
Why are you torturing me like this?
My number 2 is back. Like I said, I'm full-fledged in the horror world again. And this one is one we have actually covered on our podcast. It is a little movie called Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
Yeah.
This movie, I really enjoyed. To me, we talked about on the podcast how it is a predecessor to Scream. And I felt like when we talked about it, that had this movie not happened, I'm not so sure Scream would have, because there's so many elements from this movie that he perfected in the movie Scream. It is a Freddy Krueger movie. It is the first Freddy Krueger movie to have Wes Craven come back and actually direct again.
Mm-hmm.
Stars all the original cast, John Saxon, Robert Englund, Heather Langenkamp. And the unique twist of this movie was that everyone plays themselves, and Freddy comes into the real world and starts messing with them. The actors and directors themselves. Even Wes Craven is in this movie. I mean, like you said, there was not a slew of great movies that came out in 94. And all of these movies I stand by. I would definitely watch any of them again. And Wes Craven's New Nightmare is no exception. So that is my number 2.
I would watch yours again before I would watch mine again overall. In general,
I would not watch Time Cop. Just saying, I can't handle Jean-Claude Van Damme.
My number 1 science fiction movie of 1994 cannot be disputed as probably the number 1 of that year because it garnered 3 different series. 2 of those series lasted 10 years, 3 different movies, a slew of imitations and everything else. It starred one of your favorites, Mr. Kurt Russell. One of my favorites, who was actually in one of your movies, James Spader.
Okay.
And it was called Stargate.
I remember that.
I remember liking it. I watched it several times on VHS, mostly because I like Egypt anyway. I kind of liked the way that it blended this ancient Egyptian genre and science fiction. It is directed by Roland Emmerich, who had done Independence Day. He and Dean Devlin both had done that. I liked a lot of the performances in it. I liked the aesthetic of it. It obviously had a huge influence on science fiction going, forward. Even Luc Besson and several others, and obviously took over cable television with 3 different series: Atlantis, SG-1, Continuum, Stargate Universe.
Well, and it kind of ripped off one of the best Star Trek episodes of all time, didn't it? It's very City on the Edge of Forever, isn't it?
No,
it's just
not
a big circle you jump through and go into a different place.
Well, yes, that part of it, yes, is true. The story is much more of a Who Mourns for Adonais, an Apollo kind of story. With this, these guys were aliens who came to the Earth. It's those ancient astronaut story. But yeah, I mean, I thought Kurt Russell did a really good job in it. James Spader was great in it. It had Jay Davidson. Jay Davidson, was, I think, one of the first to become popular for being that kind of androgynous sort of look.
I can't remember if he's trans or not, but he plays trans in The Crying Game, doesn't he?
Correct.
Yeah, I can't remember if he or she is trans, though.
And he's she is very trans in this as well.
Mm-hmm. Isn't he like a boy king, like Tutankhamun or something?
Yeah. It's that kind of feeling, and he's come back to say, worship me, and they're all like, nah, not going to happen. Very, very similar to Who Mourns for Adonais. Like I said, it opened up literally the Stargate universe to all of these series and everything else. So I think, you can't look at 1994 and not say that this is probably the greatest science fiction film that came out of the year. So
I would definitely say that's the most popular, and it's the one on your list I would definitely watch again too.
Yeah, I would too.
My number 1 is another movie that we have covered on our podcast. And it is a movie that is close to my heart, mainly because of the source material. It is called Interview with the Vampire.
There you go.
This movie is a beautifully shot, gorgeous movie, but it is also, as we said in our podcast episode, probably the most terribly miscast movie in history.
Yeah.
The reason it's my number 1 is, like I said, I love the source material. It was a best-selling novel in 1976, so it took 20 years of development to finally get this on the screen, and David Geffen was the man that did it. He got director Neil Jordan together, and Rice helped write the screenplay. Unfortunately, it was cast with Tom Cruise as the lead. That's Lestat de Lioncourt, her most famous character, and Tom Cruise is really not Lestat. Brad Pitt played Louis. Brad Pitt is great. Honestly, I would have seen Brad Pitt more as Lestat than I would have, Tom Cruise. And then, of course, Antonio Banderas as Armand. And I love Antonio, but he was way too old for the part.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen Ray is in it. He's actually quite well cast, as is Kirsten Dunst playing Claudia. It is a great movie that I can honestly watch over and over again, even though it is miscast. And
Agreed.
it's my number one. So number one in 1994.
Wow. 1994 was a struggling year in general, I think. They were trying to find properties and trying to reinvent properties. I have three honorable mentions, sort of. I only mention, I do not recommend. One is called Apex, A.P.E.X., which is basically an android run amok story, again, with some time travel and everything else. Everybody seemed to be obsessed in this year with time travel, that sort of thing. Even this, Star Trek Generations is about time travel, essentially, because the Nexus is a time travel portal kind of thing. That's one of my honorable mentions. My second honorable mention is, and it also, when you Google this sci-fi in this year, this is what you get. Tech War. Do you remember Tech War?
That's one of those novels that William Shatner wrote, isn't it?
Correct. William Shatner wrote a series of novels called Tech War, T-E-K, War. 4. The original and 3 sequels were all released in 1994. Movies based on those novels.
I didn't know they made movies based on
those. And they
novels.
they are like watching an episode of Knight Rider. They are so weak bad. But it's Tech War, the original, Tech Lords, Tech Lab, and Tech Justice. All 4 came out in 1994. I was amazed. I was going, they must have shot these on the back lot.
Were they television movies?
Yes. Yeah, they were released to cable.
That's why I don't know what I don't remember them. Okay.
The other thing in my final honorable mention is, again, if you Google top science fiction in 1994, you get 5 different Emmanuel in space videos.
Are these like soft porn?
Oh yeah. I remember we had them at Blockbuster.
Holy shit.
They were Emmanuel in space, and they have all of these horrible secondary names to them, like, the Close Encounter or the Last Moon. It's just, there are these softcore porns that came out. And my last honorable mention is just the title alone, because I never saw it. It was called Test Tube Teens from the year 2000.
I can't believe I didn't come across these in my research. It's hilarious.
I want to see that one, actually, so bad. It sounds so bad.
I kind of do too. It sounds like a John Waters movie.
Yes, could be. Yeah.
Oh, well, my honorable mentions. One is decent, one you've mentioned, and one is terrible. The first one that is decent is a movie called Cemetery Man. It was an Italian film starring Rupert Everett, a British actor. It was directed by Michael Savai, who you might remember as the silver masked man in Demons, the Lamberto Bava movie. He was an actor turned director. And it is basically about a cemetery caretaker that's having to deal with a bunch of zombies in his cemetery. It's kind of a comedy, which is why I did not put it in my list of top 5, because I'm not too big on horror comedies. However, I am big on zombies, so it made my honorable mentions.
Of course it did.
I mean, it's kind of funny because he's got a gun and he lives in the cemetery in a small apartment with an Igor type character that's kind of slow. And, all of a sudden a zombie comes bursting in the door and he just picks up the gun and turns around and shoots it in the head. End of story.
There you go.
It's like it's a very common occurrence. So that would be one of mine. Another one I mentioned as an honorable mention was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which you mentioned. Mm-hmm. It is more sci-fi. I'm not entirely sure I've seen it. I think I've seen parts of it and not the entire thing. Like I remember Robert De Niro's makeup for sure. And then my last honorable mention is strictly because I love the director, but it is such an awful movie. We've covered it on our podcast. It is called In the Mouth of Madness, the John Carpenter movie.
Ooh.
Terrible movie starring Sam Neill, a Lovecraft wannabe masterpiece that is just a masterpiece of shit, really.
Yeah.
When you think about it. So those are my honorable mentions. Did you have more you wanted to talk about before I get into this long list of stuff that came out in 94?
Well, I can start your list and just give you the sci-fi ones because, well, and no, these aren't necessarily sci-fi because there are horror in here too. But
okay, we probably have some overlap then.
Trancers 4 and 5 both were released in 94. Circuitry Man 2 was released. So not Cemetery Man, Circuitry Man 2 was released. Guyver 2. Remember, Guyver was the alien suit that you could wear kind of thing. That one came out.
No.
And then I have under the horror category, Phantasm 3 came out in 94. Ghoulies 2. Unborn 2. Class of 1999 2. That's science fiction. But that came out. So that's just a beginning of the list of sequels, movies with numbers in them, kind of thing.
Well, for context that isn't sequels, I had a movie called Brain Scan starring Edward Furlong and Frank Langella.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how I ended up in that movie.
Slumming.
Right. The Lurking Fear, which was supposed to be some great Lovecraftian movie. I remember watching it. It was not good. Over in Italy, Lucio Fulci did a movie called Voices from Beyond. Another movie that I considered putting in the top 5 because of its ratings on Rotten Tomatoes is called Dark Waters. I decided to give this movie a watch, and it is awful.
Okay.
It is so bad. I was like, this is like some artsy fartsy crap, and it is not scary. So I hated it. And then also a movie called Skeeters.
Hey, I saw Skeeters and I also saw Ticks, and I've talked to you about Ticks before. Ticks was actually got some pretty scary stuff to it.
Okay.
You know,
well,
imagine a tick the size of like a small chihuahua kind of thing, like it was, and it can crawl up your leg and just start sucking.
Yeah. Well, Skeeters. Sequels. You mentioned sequels, so I'm going to try to go through this quickly. But I don't know what it is, but maybe the 90s had no ideas and they were just doing sequels to 80s movies. But here we go. Puppet Master 5, the final chapter. At least 9 more followed.
Oh my gosh.
Scanner Cop, the 4th in the Scanner series. Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead. The Birds 2, Land's End with Tippi Hedren. Pumpkinhead 2, Blood Wings. Trancers 4, Jack of Swords. Bloodlust, Subspecies 3. Leprechaun 2, Night of the Demons 2, The Unborn 2, Watchers 3, and Ghoulies 2. That's a lot of fucking sequels.
Yeah. I saw them everywhere. I was going, I can't believe there's this many sequels, and this many sequels, in my opinion, to bad movies. It wasn't like it was a great movie to begin with. You're going to do a sequel to it.
Well, I tell you what, in advance of doing another 90s year in the future, I think we're going to probably have to look a little. We may have to do a little pre-examination because I looked and I don't think a lot of great stuff came out in the 90s in general, not until like 99, right before the millennium. But I mean, I could be wrong, but just saying.
Well, we'll have to see what we do with the next one.
Yeah, I say we go back in time, man. We got to go to the 50s or the 60s or something.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right.
We'll take another year.
Yeah. And we want to thank you guys for joining us for this top 5 today of 1994. If you have any comments or criticisms, we would love to hear them below. Not that we're going to pay attention to them if you're mean to us. And while you're down there, please subscribe. If you like this show, we've got other shows out there. We've got a coming attraction show. It's called Coming to Get You. And I do some little mini horror reviews with Streaming with Tim or Shuttle with Tim. And then we, of course, have our regular show, which is Johnny Has the Keys. Much like this show, we pick one film over the last 100 years and we deep dive into that one particular film for an hour or so. If that's not enough for you, we also have bonus stuff on a Patreon channel, including television stuff like Star Trek and The X-Files. And until next time, when we'll be doing a top 5 of probably some other year, I'll be seeing you, David.
I'll see you then, Tim.
All righty. Bye.
You can't start the car,